Hey there. Today I want to tell you about a new case that we at the Canadian Constitution Foundation are involved in about free speech in a witch hunt against a village councillor in Prince Edward Island. This councillor put up a controversial sign and is now facing sanctions, and he may even be removed from his democratically elected position on council for something unpopular he said. I can't wait to tell you all about it. If you're new here, welcome. My name is Christine and I'm the litigation director with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, a legal charity that fights for fundamental freedoms in Canada. I upload regular videos about our ongoing legal cases and about other interesting developments in constitutional law in Canada. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, please hit like and subscribe below. It really helps my videos out a lot. Also, please remember nothing in my videos is ever legal advice. If you have your own legal question or problem, consult your own lawyer. So this is a case about freedom of speech and a local village councillor in PEI. His name is John Robertson. And John is a municipal councillor in the village of Murray Harbour, which is a small village with a population of just 282 people. John has a sign in front of his house. You know, the kind of sign with those plastic letters that you can change in and out for whatever occasion, the kind that you'll sometimes see in front of a school or a church. And he bought this sign at a village yard sale and put it on his own property in front of his home so he could share various messages or opinions like Happy Canada Day or Merry Christmas, or his opinions on various political issues of the day. And one message on Friday, September 29th, 2023, which is the eve of Truth and Reconciliation Day, John put up a sign that said, "Truth, mass grave hoax, reconciliation, redeem Sir John A.'s integrity." Here's a picture of the sign because I think it's actually important to see what the sign says. So John said he put this sign up because he wanted to start a conversation about what he viewed as a media perpetrated hoax. Now, let's just step back for a second so we have all of the context. This is all a reference to a news story from 2021 where there were initial reports that ground penetrating radar had discovered a mass grave with 215 bodies of Indigenous children near the former residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia. This prompted a national outcry. It was obviously a very shocking story, and it prompted protesters across Canada to topple statues of Sir John A. Macdonald or Queen Victoria, and it also resulted in churches being burned to the ground in some parts of the country. Some cities canceled Canada Day celebrations, and the flag was lowered to half-mast in Ottawa on Parliament Hill, and Parliament declared September 30th to be the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. But the story turned out to be a little bit more complicated. In 2022, the esteemed reporter Terry Glavin laid out an investigation in the National Post that found that the claims of a mass grave were not backed up. Glavin's report also found that there is limited evidence that those anomalies discovered by ground penetrating radar are in fact bodies, and that the more realistic explanation that if there are bodies buried near residential schools, that these are in unmarked graves from a cemetery that was badly cared for and whose signposts have deteriorated with time, and the people whose graves these are, that the cause of death is unknown. It's potentially cause of death of disease, which was rampant in institutions like residential schools at that time. Now, Canadians have had to grapple with our history of institutionalizing Indigenous children in these schools, where absolutely terrible abuse happened, and where many children were taken by force from their families by the state, and where, yes, children did die. 150,000 children were sent to the 130 residential schools across Canada. And when parents didn't want their children sent there, the RCMP took them by force. There was overcrowding, there was poor sanitation. This led to the spread of disease. There was unhealthy food and very terrible abusive punishment, especially for children who spoke their native Indigenous language or practiced their traditional culture or religion. There was also reported physical and sexual abuse, and this is just a terrible legacy. There is no reasonable defense of the policy of residential schools, and they are a stain on our country's history. And we should certainly examine that history. We should try to learn from the stories of children who were sent to these institutions and learn about why institutionalization is so terrible. We should listen to the stories from our friends in the Indigenous community about the legacy of the forced taking of children and the legacy that it's had on their culture. There is a lot that every Canadian can learn, and that is part of what reconciliation looks like. I think there are a lot of dangers with putting faith in the state and in government and giving the state too much power. And I think this is a vivid and heartbreaking example of that danger. I also think that it is clear at this point that the initial reports of a mass grave were wrong. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding from the media who, benefit from perpetuating the most shocking version of a story. Because remember, it was not the leaders in Kamloops who claimed that there was a mass grave, but this somehow got lost in some game of telephone that by the end of it, we had the New York Times reporting that there was a mass grave. And it actually doesn't do justice to those who were abused at the hands of our government, at the hands of the state, to inflate or distort the horror. There's actually no need, because the truth is bad enough, and distortion actually does harm. It undermines belief in the true stories of suffering from residential schools. Unfortunately, media outlets are still reporting as if there has been a discovery of a mass grave, even after the mass grave story has really been corrected. For example, there's been a lot of media coverage of this story of John and his sign in McMurray Harbor, especially in the Atlantic provinces. CTV reported, and I'm quoting from their article, local councillor John Robertson found himself in hot water due to a sign he placed on his property, which called the discovery of mass graves at some residential schools a hoax. Lots of problems in that report. First, there was no discovery of a mass grave. And second, why not just say what the sign actually said? Why paraphrase it to sort of alter the message? And CTV wasn't the only one. The sign on John's property called the detection of unmarked graves at the former sites of residential schools in the last few years a mass grave hoax. Again, why not say what the sign actually said? It didn't say anything about unmarked graves. It said truth, mass grave hoax. And I think most of us have got there by now. There isn't a mass grave. Okay, I also want to pause now to say a few things that are sort of my opinion. I would never put up a sign like this, especially not on Truth and Reconciliation Day. I do think that there isn't evidence of a mass grave, but I don't think I'd describe the reporting as a hoax. It's more like, in my opinion, I think it's more like this game of telephone where the media is incentivized to tell the most sensationalist version of a story. And I also think this is kind of missing the bigger point. The bad reporting isn't my biggest concern in the history of residential schools. My biggest concern is the government stealing children and putting them in institutions where many of them suffered abuse and some died, and where it's frankly just messed up that any school would have a cemetery. And this whole legacy makes me really angry. But I mean, John is entitled to have different concerns from me, and he seems very worried about the speed at which this mass grave narrative spread and how it led to people tearing down statues of our first prime minister. And John is entitled to believe that. And he said he wanted to start a conversation about those things. And it's not that those things don't matter to me. Of course, as I've said, the truth matters a lot, and warping it actually hurts the people that we should be listening to and hearing their stories. But it's definitely not my biggest concern in the whole history, and it's definitely not how I would even start that conversation about media distortion. Well, John did get the conversation he wanted to start. He got a lot of people reaching out to him, a lot of them angry about his sign. And in fact, he did take his sign down the next day. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, what happened next is the really big problem. On October 4th, Robertson was informed of an official complaint by 3 fellow village councillors under something called the Village Code of Conduct. And the village council had hired a former RCMP officer to investigate his sign. And this RCMP officer found that John had breached the code of conduct provisions against unethical behavior and inspiring public trust and confidence, and discrimination, intimidation, and harassment. Village Council then voted to impose a maximum penalty, a $500 fine, and impose a 6-month suspension and require a forced apology. But worst of all, the provincial minister in PEI, the minister in the provincial, not village government, who's in charge of municipalities, well, he demanded that John comply or resign. And when John refused to do either, the minister launched proceedings that could lead to his removal from village council. And to me, it's very scary that a village council can force someone to apologize and pay a fine for speaking out on his own private property about a political issue, and that the minister can force that person out of office if they don't mouth a false apology and pay a fine. If the premier or provincial minister can remove an elected official for privately expressing his opinion on a policy issue, well, I think we're in big trouble. It should be up to the people, the citizens, to decide if they want John to represent them. So this is when my organization, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, stepped in to provide John with pro bono counsel to challenge the sanctions in court. And we're concerned that the code of conduct and the bylaws, which are these rules meant to deter bad behavior like conflicts of interest and abusing your staff, things that really do need to be there. But I think that they're being increasingly weaponized to silence constitutionally protected speech like John's sign. In PEI, John's sanctions are just especially egregious. He expressed an opinion on a matter of public interest and did so on his own property. And there's no doubt that his comments were controversial, but we don't need constitutional protection for popular speech that everyone agrees with. We need it for unpopular or controversial speech. The whole point of free speech is that today's controversial speech is sometimes proven correct tomorrow. And the only way to get to the truth is to let people speak their minds. If voters are offended by John's sign, they have every right to vote for a different candidate in the next election. But Murray Harbour's council and the minister in the provincial government have no right to censor him or remove him. This needs to stop. And that's why we're paying John's legal fees. Even though I would not have said the things that John said, I don't think he should be removed from office for saying them. Only the people, the citizens, have that power. I know that this is a really difficult subject, and I'm really trying to talk about it with sensitivity, so please be sensitive in the comments as well. Remember your own children. Think about how you would feel about the state taking them away from you. And remember that this case isn't at its core about what John said. It's about our democracy and about the right of every person to express themselves, and that it's only the people, the citizens, who decide who our elected representatives are. If you're interested in following this case as it progresses, hit that notification bell and that bell icon below, and then you'll always get updates whenever I post a new video. You can also subscribe to our email freedom updates at the ccf.ca/freedom updates, and we'll send you notifications when there are updates in this case as well. All right, that's all for this video. Thanks for watching, and let's keep fighting for freedom in Canada.